take a look at basic painting tools and technique. First up is the Filbert brush, and this is one of my favorite general all-round brushes because it's got a big head for putting on a lot of paint, but it's got rounded edges, which gives it such a soft, gentle effect. So it is a lovely brush. Then we have the round brush, and as you can see, when I turn it, it's completely round on all sides. So it is a very nice thin brush and really useful for just creating thin lines and very delicate effects. Then we have a flat brush, and this brush can actually take a lot of paint. It's quite a strong brush, but it's got those square flat edges, so it gives a much stronger effect, and that's used generally for painting with thicker paint. Don't forget about your glass bottles for cleaning your brushes and sometimes for thinning down paint. Next up is your paint box. I would recommend buy a nice hardy container to keep all your paints in. Certain paints I buy at a higher quantity, so for instance 200ml white, because I use a lot of white, as well as the rest of my tubes are generally 75ml, and I'm working with a variety of colors. In terms of your canvas, I'm definitely going to be working on a lot of stretched canvases. They are my favorite because of their responsive surface. But don't forget about your canvas panel, because these are lovely for warm-up paintings, and that is what we are going to use for today's painting. So here's a quick look at the different colors that I'm going to be using for our warm-up apple painting. And because it's an apple painting, I've got quite a few different versions of red. Some are cool, some are warm reds. I've got my 200ml white, and I've got a selection of neutral colors such as Payne's Grey, Raw Umber, as well as Naples Yellow. So let's lay down some of those reds, and I'm going to show you why I'm using a variety of reds. Because in apple painting, red is the dominant color, and we need a variety of reds because we're going to be mixing the reds. And the primary red is in the middle. We've got a cooler purpley red on the right hand side, and we've got a warm orangey red on the left. And so I'm going to talk about color bias at a later stage, but basically it comes down to the fact that if you are working with a warm red, make sure that you don't mix any cools with that color, or bluey reds or blues, because it's going to get a bit dirty. So you need to know, is it a warm red or is it a cool red? Because that will just affect the way you mix with that paint. All right, talking about mixing, let's demonstrate how to blend different colors. And I'm going to lay on the primary red because I know it doesn't have too much of a color bias. So I can really mix what I want to with that primary red. And let's start out with the technique of dry brush blending. Basically, you're taking all the water off the brush, there's no water, and you're trying to take off as much paint as possible. And that means you're going to have to massage and really scrub on the color paint that you want to mix, which in this case is a yellow. And it's got a very soft, hazy effect. It's very subtle, very effective, and it's very quick to do. So dry brush blending is a great option for you to experiment with. At the top, we're going to do some glazing. In glazing, you add a lot of water to your second layer because you want a translucent effect. You want the layers to be shining through each other. You want to see the layer below, and it just creates a very rich, glowing effect. So glazing is a wonderful technique. You have to be patient because it is time consuming. You have to wait for the paint to dry before you lay on a new layer. But just take a look at that glow. So glazing is a fantastic idea to try out. Lastly, we are using some wet on wet blending, and this is almost impasto, which means it's thick paint, it's wet. And we're actually mixing it straight onto the canvas. We're not diluting anything here. And interestingly, take a look at how much the red actually overpowers the yellow. You have to keep adding yellow. Remember that some colors have just got a stronger pigment than others. So be careful when mixing darker colors into your light colors. They can overpower your light colors. So there is my canvas panel, and as you can see, I've already just sketched out the underdrawing of my object because we are working naturalistically. That's always a good idea, and to also work from a reference. And so the first step, apart from your underdrawing, is called blocking in. And this is when you are applying your general flat areas of color, and you're actually looking more at the tone, the lightness or the darkness of your painting and of the object that you're painting. So you're trying to keep it really simple, and you're trying to think in terms of lightness and darkness. And so as you can see, I'm laying on a flat area of dark color because that is the shadow area of my object, which in this case is an apple. And I'm not actually blending at the moment. I'm keeping my color relatively flat. I'm using one color, so I'm not mixing, and that is one of the keys with blocking in. Keep it very simple. Don't get caught up in the detail. Just block in simple areas of color. So let's get going with our light area on this apple. And again, I'm going to try to keep it as flat as possible. I'm minimizing my blending and techniques. We're just laying on flat areas of light and dark colors. Let's not forget about things such as the cast shadow. Remember that apple needs to look like it's in real life, like it's got a real background, lighting and shadows. And the background of a still life painting can really add so much drama, because in this case it is a cool lavender blue color that definitely complements that red rich apple, so it just adds a vibrancy to this painting. So don't forget about your background, it's really important. So our blocking in is done, and that means we can start to blend and to add complexity with our color and with, I suppose, just some of our surface detail and variety. So I'm bringing in some darker reds there. You'll see that's almost like a cool red, and I'm really starting to accentuate the shadow areas. And so the darkest area of a shadow in terms of the cast shadow is actually the area right close to the edge of that apple. So there's even blending happening on that cast shadow, so don't forget about that. And then remember, your background isn't flat. It's not one flat color. We need some variety and subtlety and just some interest. I mean, after all, the background actually takes up quite a lot of space, and you need to reward your viewer. You need to give them something to look at that's interesting. So what's lovely about this background is that it's literally monochromatic, which means you're working in shades of blue, so it's quite easy to do. And the same, I suppose, with that apple. It's almost shades of red, so there's not a huge variety of color, which is helpful for our first painting. You don't want to confuse or get your process too complicated. It's actually nice to work with the simplicity of color. So let's get into some of the texture, the surface texture of that apple. Remember, the skin is not flat. It's got some interesting, almost marbly effects. It's got highlights on it. And so you've got to be, I suppose, a little bit careful when it comes to your finishing touches. And you can see that I'm mixing, it almost looks more wet on wet here. The colors are mixing into each other on the canvas. And I'm getting so careful that I'm actually using two hands to hold that brush. I've got a natural shake in my hands. I've sometimes got to complement or help myself in that area. And so just as a general tip is to always add your highlights at a later stage. Highlights are so lovely to do. You can almost get carried away with them. So you need to kind of hold off on them, bring them in at a later stage. They just add such a pop and depth to your painting. And then don't forget about your shadow areas, because there is a lot of color and subtlety within shadow areas. So you can see I'm adding blues, and I'm looking very closely. Shadows are not black. They mustn't be flat. They can really just create such color if you get your shadows right. So there we go. There is our finished apple in a naturalistic style. I hope you've picked up some tips and techniques that can just really help you to experiment and just do a warm-up painting like this. I would really encourage you to get going with it. Just get familiar with working with different techniques. So I've talked about color bias, and color bias refers to the warm or cool undertone or tendency of a color. So an example of a color that has limited color bias or almost no color bias is a primary red, such as cadmium red. So it's quite a neutral red. It's safe. You can mix it with most colors. Then a color that has a warm bias in terms of the reds would be a vermilion. And that is a red-orange. So it's got a warm, yellowy feeling to it. And then a red that has a cool bias would be your rose or crimson reds, because it starts leaning towards your purpley reds. And so really the whole idea of this is that you need to mix according to the same color bias, because otherwise your colors are going to come out dirty. So an example of this would be, if you are mixing with a warm red, make sure that you don't mix any blues with that, otherwise it's going to start looking dirty. Blending refers to the technique of mixing colors to create a gradual transition, and this is super important when it comes to working in a naturalistic style. So we talked about different methods of blending. First up is glazing, and if you remember, this is watered down layers of paint on top of each other, and it creates a very rich glowing effect. Dry brush technique is taking off water, all the water off your brush using minimal paint. You're scrubbing and you're creating a soft, hazy effect. Wet on wet painting is using wet layers of paint on top of each other. You can get quite thick here, and it creates a bold, textured effect. Blocking in refers to the technique of describing form using large, flat areas of tone. So it's just an easy way to get going on your painting and to simplify your painting. And you would do this by blocking in 2 general areas of tone. So just think of light and your dark areas and just keep it very simple. And another way that you can differentiate between your light and dark areas is just to look for the shadow line, and that is the line that follows the edge of that dark or that light patch that you're working on.